They smiled for the cameras. They dazzled millions. They were the gods and goddesses of Hollywood's golden age, untouchable, luminous, immortal. But behind the velvet curtains of the most glamorous industry on earth lurked something far darker than scandal or heartbreak. The very sets where these legends were created were killing them. Toxic chemicals, radioactive materials, lead-based makeup, and poisoned locations turned movie magic into slow-moving tragedy. These are the stories of Hollywood's greatest stars and the silent, invisible enemies that stole their health, their vitality, and in many cases, their lives. Marilyn Monroe, the goddess consumed by glamour's chemicals. She was the most photographed woman in the world, a platinum blonde vision of perfection who seemed almost too beautiful to be real. But the reality behind Marilyn Monroe's luminous appearance was soaked in chemistry that modern toxicologists would find deeply alarming. To achieve that iconic bleached blonde hair, Monroe underwent aggressive bleaching treatments, using ammonia-based compounds and hydrogen peroxide solutions applied directly to her scalp week after week, year after year. Repeated dermal absorption of these chemicals has been linked to neurological disruption and chronic systemic inflammation. But the hair was only the beginning. Monroe's skin was maintained through a cocktail of beauty regimens that included heavy application of lead-based and bismuth-based cosmetics, products widely used in Hollywood throughout the 1940s and 1950s, long before regulatory agencies understood the cumulative danger of daily topical exposure. She wore thick studio-grade grease paint foundations for hours at a time under blazing hot Klieg lights, which caused the skin's pores to open and absorb chemical compounds at an accelerated rate. Then there was the environmental exposure on set. Monroe filmed several productions in conditions that would violate every modern workplace safety standard. On the set of The Misfits in 1960, shot in the Nevada desert near areas that had seen heavy nuclear testing activity, cast and crew were exposed to dust that environmental researchers have since described as potentially contaminated. Monroe was also known to have been prescribed barbiturates and amphetamines by studio physicians, medications that compounded the liver's burden of processing environmental toxins. Her documented symptoms in her later years, chronic fatigue, skin sensitivity, cognitive fog, and erratic emotional states, align disturbingly well with profiles of individuals experiencing low-level chronic chemical toxicity. The glamour was real, but so was the poison hiding beneath it. John Wayne, the Duke, felled by the desert's deadly secret. John Wayne was the embodiment of American toughness. A man's man, a screen warrior who seemed invincible. But the slow erosion of the Duke's health may have begun in the spring of 1954, when he traveled to the remote Utah desert to film The Conqueror, one of cinema's most notorious productions, and one of its most deadly. The film was shot in St. George, Utah, just 137 miles downwind from Yucca Flat, Nevada, where the United States government had been conducting above-ground nuclear weapons tests as recently as 1953. The soil, the air, and the very dust that swirled through the canyons of Snow Canyon State Park, where the cast and crew filmed for weeks on end, had been saturated with radioactive fallout. The Atomic Energy Commission had declared the region safe. It was not. Wayne spent weeks on that desert location, rolling in the dirt for action sequences, breathing the dust, working in conditions where invisible radioactive particles were present in the environment. Director Dick Powell cast members Pedro Armendariz, Agnes Moorehead, and Susan Hayward all developed cancer in the years that followed. Of the 220 cast and crew members associated with the Conqueror, 91, nearly half, were diagnosed with cancer at some point after filming. By any statistical measure, this cluster represented something far beyond coincidence. John Wayne himself was diagnosed with stomach cancer in 1964, survived after a radical surgery that removed an entire lung, and then battled the disease again until his death from stomach cancer in 1979. Wayne publicly dismissed the connection between the filming location and his illness, insisting he was a heavy smoker, and that was sufficient explanation. But researchers, journalists, and oncologists who examined the case have drawn a very different conclusion. The Duke was tough to the end, but the desert had already done its quiet, devastating work. Susan Hayward, a warrior actress brought down by radioactive dust. Susan Hayward won her Academy Award for I Want to Live, a film about a woman fighting for her life. The heartbreaking irony is that Hayward spent the final years of her own life doing exactly the same thing, waging a desperate battle against a form of cancer that many researchers believe was seeded in the radioactive desert soil of Utah during the filming of The Conqueror. Hayward was a fiercely physical actress, known for throwing herself into demanding roles with total commitment. On the set of The Conqueror, she was no different, diving into scenes, working in the dust, fully present in an environment that was quietly saturated with isotopes from nuclear fallout. Like her co-stars, she breathed the air, worked in the dirt, and returned home with no idea that her body had been exposed to something with the potential to reshape her cellular chemistry. In the years following production, Hayward began experiencing symptoms that she initially dismissed as the natural consequences of a demanding career. But the progression of her illness told a darker story. She was eventually diagnosed with multiple brain tumors, a diagnosis that devastated the Hollywood community and shocked those who knew her as one of the strongest women in the industry. She experienced seizures, vision problems, and a rapid physical decline that stood in brutal contrast to the powerhouse performer the world had known. Susan Hayward died on March 14, 1975, at just 57 years old. Friends and colleagues who survived her were left haunted by the statistical nightmare surrounding The Conqueror and the undeniable pattern that linked so many of its participants to cancer diagnoses. Hayward had played survivors on screen her entire career. In the end, the real-world threat was one no amount of talent or tenacity could overcome. Agnes Moorehead, the scene stealer, silenced by an invisible killer. Agnes Moorehead was one of the most versatile and respected character actresses of Hollywood's golden age, a consummate professional who worked alongside Orson Welles in Citizen Kane, and later became beloved to television audiences as Endora on Bewitched. She was sharp, opinionated, brilliant, and deeply convinced in her final years that she knew exactly what had made her sick. Moorehead was part of the Conqueror cast that traveled to the radioactive desert locations in Utah in 1954. Unlike some of her co-stars who maintained diplomatic silence about the potential cause of their illnesses, Moorehead was outspoken. She reportedly told friends and colleagues that she believed the filming location had caused her cancer, and she was furious at the studio, at the government, at the industry that had placed its workers in a zone of invisible danger without warning or protection. She was diagnosed with uterine cancer and died in April 1974 at age 73 after a prolonged battle with the disease. The timing placed her squarely within the terrible cluster of cancer diagnoses that swept through the Conqueror, cast and crew in the decades following production. Moorehead's willingness to speak about what she believed had happened to her made her, in some ways, an early voice for accountability in an industry that preferred silence. Beyond the Nevada fallout exposure, Moorehead, like virtually every actress of her era, had spent decades exposed to toxic studio cosmetics, chemical-heavy wigs and theatrical adhesives, and the pervasive fumes from studio lighting equipment. For Golden Age character actors who worked constantly, the cumulative toxic load of a career spent under studio lights was substantial. Moorehead paid the price, and she never let Hollywood pretend otherwise. Clark Gable, the king whose kingdom came at a cost. Clark Gable was Hollywood royalty, the self-assured, effortlessly masculine leading man who defined what it meant to be a movie star in the 1930s and 1940s. But the king of Hollywood carried physical burdens that the glamorous public image carefully concealed, and the conditions he worked in throughout his career contributed to a health trajectory that ended far too soon. Gable filmed Gone with the Wind in conditions that were, by any modern standard, genuinely hazardous. The burning of Atlanta sequence involved real fire on the backlot, creating enormous quantities of smoke and airborne particulate matter. Cast and crew were exposed to combustion byproducts for extended periods during those famous sequences, and Gable was famously present on set throughout the grueling production schedule. But it was The Misfits in 1960, his final film, that many historians point to as the production that broke Clark Gable's body. Filmed in the Nevada desert under brutal conditions, Gable insisted on performing many of his own stunts, including sequences where he was dragged across the desert floor by a truck while wrangling a wild horse on a rope. The physical punishment was immense, and Gable performed these sequences repeatedly in extreme heat while the production was plagued by delays. He was also exposed to the same Nevada desert environment that carried documented concerns about fallout from nearby nuclear testing sites. Gable suffered a massive heart attack just 10 days after completing The Misfits and died on November 16, 1960, at age 59. While his history of heavy smoking and the physical demands of his final film are the most frequently cited factors, the cumulative exposure to toxic set environments, chemical fumes from decades of studio productions, and the grueling conditions of his final desert location shoot painted a picture of a body pushed well past its limits by the industry that celebrated him. Rudolph Valentino, the silent era's toxic glamour machine. Long before the dangers of industrial chemicals in entertainment were even conceptually understood, the silent era was running its stars through a gauntlet of toxic preparation. Rudolph Valentino, the smoldering Latin lover who made women faint in cinema aisles across America, was one of the earliest victims of Hollywood's chemical culture, though the mechanisms were not recognized during his lifetime. The cosmetics used in silent film production were significantly more toxic than even the already dangerous products of the later studio era. Because black and white orthochromatic film stock had difficulty rendering skin tones faithfully, actors wore extremely heavy applications of stage-derived grease paint containing significant concentrations of white lead, zinc compounds, bismuth subnitrate, and mercury-based preservatives. These products were applied directly to the face and neck, often covering the entire head, and worn for long production days under intensely hot carbon arc lighting. Valentino made film after film throughout the early 1920s, each production requiring hours of daily chemical application and removal using harsh solvents. The repeated dermal absorption of heavy metals across years of intensive work represented a toxic burden that his body quietly accumulated. His personal grooming regimen also incorporated products of the era that contained chemical ingredients now understood to be harmful. Valentino died in 1926 at just 31 years old from complications following emergency surgery for a perforated ulcer and pleuritis. While the immediate cause of death was infection-related, his rapid physical decline and the severity of his condition have prompted historical health analysts to consider the cumulative effects of years of heavy cosmetic chemical exposure on an immune system and organ function. The industry mourned its great lover. It never examined what it had done to him. Bela Lugosi, Dracula, drained by the fog machines. Bela Lugosi gave the world one of cinema's most iconic characters, his portrayal of Count Dracula in 1931 forever defining the vampire in popular culture. But the atmospheric magic that made universal horror films so visually stunning, the swirling fog, the mysterious mists that curled through castle sets and graveyard sequences, was created using chemical compounds that presented genuine respiratory and neurological hazards to the actors who worked within them for hours at a time. Early fog effects in Hollywood were created using a variety of chemical methods, including the vaporization of mineral oils, the burning of chemical compounds to create smoke and haze, and later, the use of sulfur dioxide-based fog systems. These techniques created the visual atmosphere that audiences adored, but they also filled enclosed studio stages with airborne chemicals that cast and crew inhaled throughout long production days. For actors like Lugosi, who filmed in these environments repeatedly across multiple productions spanning decades, the respiratory exposure was significant. Lugosi also faced the compounding factor of chronic pain from a World War I injury to his leg, which led him to a dependence on the narcotic medications prescribed by Hollywood-era physicians. These medications placed additional stress on his liver and kidneys, the organs most responsible for processing and eliminating the toxic compounds absorbed through inhalation and cosmetic exposure on set. He spent his later years in a tragic cycle of addiction, poverty, and declining health, voluntarily committing himself to a California state hospital for treatment in 1955, a moment of remarkable self-awareness and courage. He died in August 1956 at age 73 of a heart attack. His beloved Dracula cape was buried with him. The fog machines that had made him legendary had spent decades filling his lungs with something far less romantic than atmosphere. Vivien Leigh, beauty under siege from every direction. Vivien Leigh was arguably the most exquisitely beautiful actress of Hollywood's golden age, a combination of intelligence, fragility, and incandescent talent that made her Scarlett O'Hara one of the most indelible performances in cinema history. But Leigh's life was a sustained battle against forces both internal and external, and the toxic environments of the film industry compounded an already complex medical picture in ways that historians are only beginning to fully examine. Leigh suffered from what is now understood to have been bipolar disorder, but in the 1940s and 1950s she was subjected to treatments that were themselves deeply harmful, including electroconvulsive therapy administered repeatedly over the course of her life, and the prescription of pharmaceutical cocktails that interacted poorly with her system and left her physically depleted for weeks at a time. On set, Leigh was a perfectionist who worked longer hours than almost anyone around her, which meant extended exposure to studio conditions that included chemical hair treatments, heavy lead-based stage makeup applied daily, the chemical fumes of studio lighting systems, and the enclosed air of sound stages where ventilation was minimal. During the production of Gone with the Wind, already an extraordinarily demanding shoot, she was exposed to the smoke and combustion byproducts of the burning Atlanta sequences alongside Clark Gable and the broader cast. Leigh was also a heavy smoker, and her tuberculosis diagnosis in the 1940s created a pulmonary vulnerability that made any airborne chemical exposure significantly more dangerous for her than for her peers. Her lungs were compromised tissue, absorbing the same studio air that healthier cast members could somewhat better withstand. Vivien Leigh died in July 1967 at age 53 from tuberculosis. But the full story of what her body endured across a career of breathtaking performances is a story of beauty under sustained, multi-directional siege. Gene Tierney, Lead, Light, and the Price of Perfection. Gene Tierney possessed what many considered the most perfect face in Hollywood, a symmetrical, almost architectural beauty that led Daryl F. Zanuck to call her the most beautiful woman in film history. But behind that celebrated face was a woman whose health was systematically undermined by the very industry that worshipped her appearance. Tierney's exposure to the toxic cosmetic culture of Golden Age Hollywood was consistent and prolonged. The lead-based and heavy metal compound foundations used on studio actresses in the 1940s were applied to Tierney's skin in heavy layers for virtually every production day of her career during the studio system's peak. The removal of these products required strong chemical solvents that stripped the skin's natural barrier, increasing absorption of residual toxic compounds. This cycle, application, absorption, chemical removal, repeated thousands of times across a career, represents a chronic heavy metal exposure profile that modern occupational health experts would find deeply concerning. But Tierney's most devastating personal tragedy came not from set cosmetics, but from a wartime encounter that illustrates how Hollywood's world intersected with broader public health disasters. During World War II, a fan who was ill with rubella broke quarantine to meet Tierney at a USO event. Tierney subsequently contracted rubella during the early stages of her pregnancy, and her daughter Daria was born with severe mental disabilities and was deaf and partially blind. The grief of this experience compounded by a predisposition to depression, led to Tierney's mental breakdown and a series of hospitalizations, including electroconvulsive treatments. The pharmaceutical interventions she received during her psychiatric treatment, combined with the cumulative toxic load from decades of studio cosmetic exposure, created a physiological burden that her body struggled to carry. Tierney survived, wrote a remarkably candid memoir, and outlived many of her contemporaries, dying in 1991. But the price of that perfect face had been paid in ways no camera ever captured. Montgomery Clift, the method actor's toxic environment. Montgomery Clift was one of the most gifted actors of his generation, a searingly intense, psychologically complex performer whose influence on American acting cannot be overstated. He was also a man whose body was subjected to an accumulation of toxic insults that began on set and deepened with every passing year of his troubled, brilliant life. Clift worked extensively in outdoor and location settings during a period when film productions gave little consideration to environmental hazards. His work in The Misfits, alongside Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe, placed him in the same Nevada desert environment with the same concerns about fallout-contaminated dust and soil. The production was one of the most chaotic and physically demanding in Hollywood history, and Clift, already physically fragile, following a near-fatal car accident in 1956 that had required extensive reconstructive surgery, was pushing his compromised body through extreme conditions. The accident itself had introduced a new layer of pharmaceutical complexity to Clift's health. The reconstructive surgeries had left him in chronic pain, and the painkillers and sedatives prescribed to manage both the physical and psychological aftermath of the crash placed enormous stress on his liver. This pharmaceutical burden, compounding the baseline toxic exposure from years of studio productions involving chemical cosmetics and enclosed soundstage environments, created a deteriorating internal picture that manifested externally as the visible physical decline that shocked those who had known Clift in his prime. Clift also suffered from hypothyroidism that went undiagnosed for an extended period, a condition that impaired his body's ability to process and eliminate toxins efficiently, effectively amplifying the impact of every chemical exposure he experienced. He died in July 1966 at just 45 years old from an occlusive coronary artery attack. His physician reportedly described his body as that of a man 20 years older. Hollywood had consumed Montgomery Clift completely, and the toxins it fed him had helped make sure of it. The golden age of Hollywood was a factory of dreams, and like all factories, it had byproducts that nobody wanted to acknowledge. These legends gave everything to their craft, performing on sets laced with radioactive fallout, breathing air thick with chemical fog, wearing poison on their faces in the name of beauty, and trusting an industry that rarely looked beyond the next production. Their stories are not just cautionary tales. They are a debt owed. We remember them in their luminous, glittering prime. We should also remember what it truly cost them to stand there and shine.